Whenever it comes to preaching or talking about the Bible, there are a couple of subjects that, generally speaking, are considered very, very sensitive, if not entirely off limits. Some of those things are things like giving. That's something that obviously a lot of people feel very personal about. Some of those other things oftentimes are talking about, different types of sins or hang-ups that our culture has deemed somewhat acceptable or not really that big of a deal. However, when we look at the scriptures, they say, it's not really all that great. Some of those things obviously involve, stuff like, premarital relations and stuff like that. But one of those other things that I have found can oftentimes be more dicey than either of those other two subjects is when it comes to how we raise our families. This relates to not just our children, but also how children relate to parents, how we relate to siblings, how we relate to extended family. There is a very important lesson to be taken out of the scriptures because everything in the Bible is very inherently family oriented. This makes a lot of sense when you consider the roots of everything that we're doing and how the reality of Judaism, especially pre-Christ Judaism, is that it was a religion that, even though the temple played a large role, very much centered around the family unit. A lot of times families would actually go and conduct a lot of the spiritual and religious observations and ceremonies that took place. A lot of the feast days that people would celebrate would take place around a family dinner table. But somehow we hit a more modern society and that family aspect started melting away, and that's led us to a very interesting place when it comes to how we view the role of the church. Now, I know that I've made comments in the past about how I spent almost a decade working in youth ministry, and that was kind of what, kind of molded me and shaped me into the individual that I am today, at least when it comes to ministry. Well, in doing that, there were certain things that I like to bring up from time to time, very delicately. In the course of a week, you have something like, it's like 168 hours, I think. And that is total hours in your schedule that you have for everything, including sleeping and eating and school and everything else. About a third of that time ends up being time that you spend actually sleeping, a hair less than that. Some of us are a little bit better than others. When you start looking at teens, the amount of time they spend in school is just over 20% of that time, okay? So now you're at 50% between school and sleep. You start looking at things like hobbies, and hobbies can be anywhere from 7% and 10%. Now, when I say hobbies, I'm talking about all that stuff, including travel ball and stuff like that. So between 7 and 10% of a teen's week may be taken up by that. But what about when it comes to church? Well, when it comes to church, I looked at it this way. I specifically had a lot of people that I was ministering to who would basically show up to youth group, and that was it. They wouldn't show up on Sundays. If they were showing up on Sundays, they were totally phased out or in their phone or something like that. So I said, okay, if I assume that I'm doing nothing from the moment that they show up to the moment that they leave, but teaching them the Bible, then that means that I have about an hour and a half out of that 168 hours. What that amounts to is less than 1% of their week. If you actually look at the amount of time that's actually teaching them about Christ, it ends up being a fraction of that, so you end up with something actually more like 1/3 or less of 1% of their time that a youth minister has to give them Jesus. So what's the moral of the story? Why am I giving you all these numbers? It's because of this. As families, if we are relying on individuals that are employed or volunteering at a church in order to give Christ to our children, then we are failing them because they have so many other influences in their lives. So much of the rest of their time is spent with every other thing. And if all that we can devote to trying to give them knowledge of this God who loves them is 1/3 of 1% of their time, what does that say about the place God holds in their life? The reality is when you look at how Christ has been taught to generations upon generations, you look at the early church, you look at households prior to the coming of Christ, God was always taught within the context of a family. And we can sit here and we can try to argue that, times have changed and our society has changed and so we need different things, and that's fine. But again, 1/3 of 1%, that's absolutely nothing. The reality is that as parental figures, and I say that specifically, parental figures, we have an obligation to the next generation. All of us are a parental figure. We all interact with other people at some point in time in our lives, in our week, in our months, in our years, that are younger individuals that are trying to figure out life. We all have an obligation to this upcoming generation, especially when that generation are people that are in our household or people that we interact with on a daily basis. There is a God that loves them and wants them to have everything out of life that they could possibly want to be fulfilled. How does that reflect on what we think of Christ when we won't give them that because it's too inconvenient, because we have too many other things going on in our lives? I know that it's really, really hard. And again, it's very unpopular to start getting into anything that may suggest that maybe how we raise a generation is insufficient. But I think we're letting down our kids. I've seen it many, many, many times. Why won't the pastor do more? Why won't XYZ church do more? Why won't ABC ministry do more to, help teach my children? I think it's important they have a relationship with Christ, and so that's why I think they need to be in X club. Mom, Dad, why don't you teach them about Jesus? Because you know what? There's no greater influence that these individuals are going to have in their life other than those individuals that they grow up with every single day. I love how Paul refers to many individuals in the early church as if they are his children and he is acting like a father. You can really see a lot in how he treats them and the things that he does and the things that he doesn't do. He doesn't use religion like a bludgeon, right? Because I think a lot of us have been in situations where we've seen individuals that are either parents or parental type figures in our life who have maybe actually actively pushed us away from the faith because they use their religion in that way. But you also see Paul actually doing what he needs to do, actually being willing and in some way excited about telling these individuals about the truth, even when that truth is difficult. I've heard many parents come up to me in my previous ministry work when they said things like, well, I just don't want my child to grow up resenting the church. And kind of the crass way I always wanted to respond to that was, well, you don't have to worry about that because they're never at church. That's overly sarcastic and overly cynical, but it really is the truth. If you're not exposing somebody to the church at all, then you don't have to worry about them resenting the church because they're going to see the church as a foreign entity. They're going to see God as a foreign entity. The only individual who can really give them everything that they're going to want out of life, they see as some third party. But what you see Paul doing is you see Paul going in and having deliberate conversations, bringing things up in love and care and compassion, being harsh when he needs to be harsh, but then being gentle when he needs to be gentle in order to make certain that the truth comes through. But this conversation doesn't stop there because this is a two-way street, right? I mean, even if we were to look at something and say, hey, look, Pastor Joseph, I'm not really resonating with this because I don't see myself, I'm not a biological parent, or I don't see myself as a parent in the lives of other people, then, well, you know what? You're a child of somebody. And in the same way that I say parental figures, you're also a child figure to somebody. There are individuals in your life who have tried to reach out and try to provide some amount of guidance, some amount of wisdom into your life. And we have to also regard those individuals. You can look at the life of Christ, and even within the life of Christ, something you'll talk about in your small groups in just a moment, is how his parents actually actively played a role in his life. You realize that his parents answered a call and did things that kept Jesus in his infancy safe. You see how his parents actually brought him to the temple when he was young and just kind of nearly about ready to enter into adulthood so that he could have some of his first interactions with learned scribes and priests. All of these things that were happening in Jesus' life so often were spurred on by the fact that he had these parental figures in his life that were raising him and bringing him up. Even though he was fully God, his fully human side still needed that family unit around him in order to initiate great things. And if that is the case, and even Christ needed parental figures in our life, then what qualification do we think that we have that we don't need that same type of support? We can learn so much from the individuals that God has placed in our lives. But in order to do that, it requires a degree of humility, and it requires a degree of even obedience to those people that God has put in our lives. Not to say that those individuals are perfect, because we all know that that's not the case. but that God did place these individuals in our lives for a reason. You don't have to put a lot of effort into looking around and seeing a lot of the chaos and moral decay in our society. There are tons of people who have many different reasons that they attribute this decay towards, and there's probably some truth to many of them, if not a little bit of truth to all of them. But the one thing that is the common denominator between almost all of the causes that people like to point to is the decay of the family. Family units, whether those are immediate biological families, whether those are kind of group and community families, or whatever the case may be, have decayed over time. And as a result of that, we see children looking to other places to try to figure out what is truth, what is important, what is a priority in my life. And if mom and dad, if grandma and grandpa, if aunt and uncle, or if, family friend so-and-so, whatever that adult figure is in my life that's acting like a parent at the moment, isn't helping me to discern what is important, what takes a priority, where I'm going to find fulfillment, then you know what? The rest of the world is going to be more than happy to offer solutions, and we may not like where those solutions lead. Many other people, maybe even their peers, maybe the media, maybe political leaders, are going to be happy to put things on a silver platter and say, just pursue this, young person. If you do this, if you vote this way, if you pursue this kind of lifestyle, if you question these things in your life, then you know what? Maybe then you'll be able to fill that God-shaped hole that's in your heart. But we know better. And so how irresponsible is that for us, knowing what these children crave and knowing what they're going to need in life, to hold that back simply because, what? We think it might be awkward, because we think that should be somebody else's responsibility, because we think that the responsibility for giving them Christ should come at the hands of somebody who has access to 1/3 of 1% of their week. So I would say this: if we want something more for our children than just simply some sort of nuanced side facet of their culture, or something that they just kind of keep in the back of their head so that maybe when they hit 20 or 30, maybe then they'll start taking it seriously. If no, we instead want people who are actually growing up knowing who Christ is, so that Christ can walk with them along the way as they mature, as they develop, and as they figure out who they are, then we need to be taking our responsibilities seriously. As parents, as grandparents, as aunts and uncles, as friends, as mentors, as teachers, as coaches, whatever it may be that we are. We have an obligation to these children, and we would be wise to actually take that obligation seriously and give them what it is we know that they need. Because otherwise, they're going to grow up looking for what they need somewhere else. And we may not like ultimately what that does or what that results in their life. It is truly for their benefit. This is the lesson that I have for you today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.